a series simply entitled Meeting Jesus. And that could mean many things, but what we're doing is we're engaging the various ways in which Jesus meets us and changes us, meaning the ways in which He who represents so much meets us in all of our needs. And so last week we started with Jesus as the great shepherd, because that's a theme by which God said He was, that we all need the great shepherds, and they were failing, and He comes to be that ultimate and final and greatest of shepherd to the human soul. And there's Jesus, the great physician, the one who comes and has the power over our bodies and healing, and we can engage Him that way. So we're looking at these various ways, but recognizing that to meet Jesus is to meet one who has the power to change us. And if we really meet Him, and the more clearly we meet Him for who He is, the more clearly we will be changed by it. No figure in human history has ever changed more lives than Jesus, known as the Christ. Even those historians who might not surrender themselves and trust themselves to Jesus and believe in that sense would recognize that He has the greatest impact in human history. H.G. Wells, who some of you know for various reasons, and was one of the great historians who wrote the short history of the world. And H.G. Wells said this, he says, "I'm an historian, I'm not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all history, irrevocably the very center of history." And what we see is that not only is that a profound statement, and which should make anyone stop and wonder, but it's even more profound when you realize that anyone else who one might consider to have any huge role in human history and to have changed the world, it would be because of what? Something huge they did. They raised up an empire. They were a great warrior who defeated some other power. They were maybe a scientist who invented something that eventually, changed all of medicine going forward. Be something along those lines, but something of world renown. Jesus did none of that. Jesus didn't raise up any empire. He didn't simply introduce something into the material world. Jesus changed lives. In fact, He changed history and He changed the world simply because He changed lives, one by one. And that is different than anyone else who's ever existed. He changed lives. Everyone that He encountered, as we kind of read through the accounts of their lives and the lives they describe, realizes that He comes as one who defies the world as it is and seems to call people into the world as it is meant to be and is in eternity and will be. And He calls them to that, and they either find themselves in this joyful allegiance to give their whole lives in devotion, or they become desperate in trying to hold on to the world as they know it, where they find power for however long. Either devotion or desperation and defense seem to be what comes about. And the reality is, from that point forward, He continues to change lives as they meet Him. As we could say it, and some have, when we really meet Jesus, you are never the same again. His teaching challenges your understanding. His compassion softens your heart. His love turns your life around. And He turns your world upside down, and then you realize it's actually right side up for the first time. That is the kind of impact that so many of us would say He's had, or He's having, or that we sense that He is seeking in our lives. And so we want to meet Him on that. And this morning, we're going to engage how the very first followers were called to Him, and how He engaged them as He called them to follow Him. And we discover this impact, maybe at its most profound level, right there in that first meeting. So I invite you to follow with me in the Gospel of John, the first chapter. You can see the insert in your bulletin. You can follow the words on the screen. Gospel of John, starting in verse 35. That's a bit of a long section, but it's one of the accounts that's given to us. We know in other accounts Jesus had prayed he had gone off to pray to decide who He was going to call as as his first and core disciples that he would work with and train. But here we see how he engages them in John's gospel in these moments. And so starting in verse 35, John the Baptist, you may remember, is the kind of the forerunner, the prophet who'd been calling people to repent, turn to God, get ready, because God's on the move. And it's John the Baptist who introduces Jesus and says, here's the Messiah. And we kind of come into that. So it says here, the next day John was there again with two of his disciples, because he had a band of people who were like, this is, we like this guy. This is like the prophet. We want to be learning from him. And it says, when he saw Jesus, John the Baptist, passing by, he said, look, behold the Lamb of God. When the two disciples heard him, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, what do you want? They asked, Rabbi, which means teacher, where are you staying? Come, he replied, and you'll see. So they went and they saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. Now it was about the 10th hour. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who had heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. Most think that the other one was John himself, the writer of this gospel, so probably Andrew and John. The first thing Andrew did at this point was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is the Christ, which means anointed one. And he brought him to Jesus, and Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas, which one translated is Peter. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, who he may have already been looking to call, he said to him, follow me. Now Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. So they were probably friends. Philip found Nathanael and told him, we have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Nathanael asked. Come and see, said Philip. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said to him, here is a true Israelite, in whom there is nothing false. How do you know me? Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you. Then Nathanael declared, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus said, you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You shall see greater things than that. He then added, I tell you the truth. You shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. There's a lot in this, and I know it's kind of a long text, and we're not going to engage all the various things that we might consider in it. But central to it, and what I want us to grasp, is the fact that here is God coming and calling these lives to himself. And the nature by which he does it is far more maybe dramatic, even revolutionary to them and ultimately to us than we might grasp. And part of what can help us to grasp it is the fact that if we consider how the educational system, the normal way that such things would happen, that lives would be called to learn from a rabbi, we realize just how revolutionary this is and what it declares about God and about who Jesus is to us. See, normally, children around the age of 6 would start their a season, some years of formal education, kind of like we would put a child in a kindergarten, and many people today still say that first grade, around age 6, is the most formative. It's kind of the reading, writing, the core stuff that one starts into. And that it was about age 6 that they would generally go into school, probably with just the local synagogue, local rabbi. What's amazing is that they would learn by about the age of 10, the majority, to have memorized the entire Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. And most of us are going, I'm just trying to work on like one verse, and kids are pretty amazing in memory, and they would be immersed, and it was kind of like the house of the book for those years. At the end of those years, most of those children, now around age 10, would just now enter into or begin to learn their parents' trades. So it might be fishing, it might be tent making, it might be working the fields or the cattle. They would move on. They were kind of done with that kind of education. They needed to be in the productive side of life. Except there would be those students who had kind of excelled, and the rabbi might have seen something special. They would continue now at age 10. And they would continue till about age 14 or 16 in the house of learning, and they would learn and memorize the entire Old Testament as we know it today. Just that's mind-blowing to think of, but this is what they would. They would be steeped into that word. And they were people of that word. And so it is that finally, at the end of that time, there would be these kind of master rabbis, the ones who people saw as truly the greatest, the few. And they had their own schools of thought. So it'd be kind of like this man had this view, this school of thought, very highly respected amongst all of maybe Israel. And you could apply and go to him, and you would go to him and say, at that point, now I'm age 14 or 16, I'm either going to, return to my parents' trade, or I would say, may I follow you? And that would be my asking, my request to take on their yoke, their way of life, and to learn from them. And then if you were accepted by them, you would give your whole life to them. 24/7, you would go off and follow them and learn their way of life. It was never merely about learning knowledge. It was about learning how to live out that knowledge, out the truth of who God was in real life. And that's what one would do. But that would be only the best of the best. And the rabbi would be challenged, and there's only a few of them, to be able to determine who to accept, because to accept one who might not have the ability to do that, they only were going to commit their lives to a few, their whole lives to this few. So their choices were huge, and they had to think, do they have it? Are they really the best of the best? And secondly, their whole reputation was going to be based on how these few lives were going to be able to live this out. Did they really have that character in them? And so there is the way it would normally work. Now, what do we see in what Jesus did? Jesus comes to whom? He comes to those who had dropped out long ago. These are the ones who had gone off into their trade. I'm not going to say they were dropouts in the way we might use that term in some derogatory way. Some of them were probably relatively successful, relatively honorable in what they were doing in their community, but they had dropped out of the religious formal system long ago. They were not the ones that question got answered 5, 10, maybe even 15 years prior to this. They were done. And they had just moved in, and in this case, these were fishermen. Others were of other trades. And so he's going to those who were, in a sense, dropped out of the system. That's the first thing. They were the ones they were never going to be a part of what God was really doing. And he goes to them. And the second thing is they didn't come to him and ask, could I follow you, Rabbi? He comes to them and asks that question. Now imagine that. And you realize that the height of that it's revolutionary. It's shocking. And if you and I can conceive of the fact that when they declare that he is the Messiah, the Christ, what are they recognizing in him? That he is the one whom God said he would send to save the world in some way. They weren't clear of all of the nature of this figure. But he was the one coming from God, and that's profound. Imagine if you were one who believed that God had called you as a people, not unique, but that ultimately to bless the whole world. I'm going to bless the planet, and your people I called to myself through Abraham, formed you as a people to save the whole planet, to save the whole of creation. That's a pretty big thing to wear. Now you find out, and one day one will be born, and he will be the Messiah, one that comes and somehow bears myself to the world. That's a big deal. Now come to think, and you find out there's rumors he was born in your lifetime. That's a big deal. The Savior of the world, of all creation, has come. Now imagine you find out he's in your town. You'd be going, oh my gosh, he's going to be picking a few people to redeem the entire creation through. You'd be going, that's a big deal. How's he going to do it? That's just mind-blowing. Now imagine he walks up to you and says, I want to choose you. You'd be going, that's wonderful, big mistake. I don't know what you think, but that is the gravity of what he's doing. And what should strike us is that the real shock in this is not that they believed in God. That wasn't a really big deal for most. It still isn't a big deal. Today, maybe some think it's a big deal to believe. Most people believed in God, and most still do. The real shock, that God believed in them. We think that the biggest question is whether we believe in God. And from our kind of vantage point, I suppose, it is a great starting place, to ask, do I believe in God? Because you kind of have to move out from there. But I don't know that that is the biggest question. I think if we could see all of our existence and we could rise up above it, the grand question is really not whether you believe in God, because it doesn't change anything, I hate to tell you. The grand question is, does God believe in you? Does your existence have meaning and purpose? Does God see in you something, or is your existence merely hollow, merely random, just a material substance that comes and goes? The question is, does God believe in you in such a way as that as your life bears meaning? And that's what we see awaken in them. And that's what I want us to grasp in this. And I think when we think of God believing in them, we see it in the fact that He comes to them from heaven and He calls them. And that is that there's this way that He calls them out to join Him in something bigger is itself kind of what can stir us, and we have a hard time with that, because that sometimes we think, I don't want any expectations. We have this idea of freedom that I will find my greatest freedom when what? When I'm free to do whatever I want. Where I am free of anybody's demands and anybody's expectations. That is when I will be my truest and greatest self. I encourage you to think about that. Because if one reflects deeply, when one is free from any connection to anything that expects anything of you, you ultimately end up excluded from life. You ultimately are just adrift out in a meaningless existence. There's a man named Rabbi Loy who did his life work on reflecting upon these questions, and he said this. He said, in a life in which there is no demand, there is no meaning. If no demand is put on you, then you are, in a sense, excluded from what? From life itself. To be demanded of gives us dignity. If someone demands something of you, it means he takes you seriously. And it's in this sense that we see Jesus coming to these lives, and He's taking them seriously in a way they could never have taken themselves. They're probably thinking, this is just, we can barely grasp this. And I think the truth is, He believes in them in a way they could not even yet have believed in themselves, as only He could. And the first and the primary way I want us to grasp this, that the fact that He is the one who believes in you, is to realize that Jesus is the one, or Christ is the one, who calls you as the very source, that He is the very source and center of life. So He alone represents what can root your existence. He's the creator of everything. And He had made Himself known, and now He comes and reveals Himself. This is why they declare, hey, He's the Messiah, that is the Christ, this anointed one who's come from God. And I think this is so important for us to grasp, because we spend our whole lives in this way trying to tell ourselves that we're going to find ourselves in ourselves. Like, you know what, I just need to go find myself. And I get that. A lot of what we're doing and a lot of our journeys, and I think a lot of you will relate to this, is that we kind of know ourselves in relationship to our family or whatever household, whatever attachments we have initially in life. And then we realize, but I have to individuate and find myself, because I didn't choose all those attachments. I'm not sure I want all those attachments. And I have to find myself somehow in the uniqueness of my choices, my will, my feelings, and my thoughts. All of that true. So we venture off into life to find ourselves. But the truth is, no soul has ever found itself. You can't, by its very nature, find yourself. And throughout most of life, all of human history, one's greatness was defined by the ability to find and be included in something bigger than yourself. So greatness was the one who would go and he would give his life to the grand empire or the military, who would go and defeat some horrible army, and we defeated evil, or something along these lines. So greatness was always being part of something bigger than yourself, up until, for the first time ever, that I'm aware of, can you find this idea that we have in the last 34 years of kind of our Western culture, created the idea that you find yourself not in giving yourself to something bigger, you find yourself in yourself. You find yourself by just trying to figure out who you are, figuring out what you're into, and then just being yourself. Whatever that means. This whole idea of finding yourself and being yourself, it's like, okay, really cool. You like blue shirts, and that's really cool. You can wear, is that yourself? I mean, like, what is that? Is that really the substance? It does not give you substance to find your style. It doesn't give you substance to merely find your ideas. Unless then you're just a person of ideas. You have your favorite movies. That's great. But is that your existence? Does it have any meaning bigger than that? The truth is, it is always, and we come down to this question, will I find myself in giving myself to something greater than myself or living for myself as the ultimate end of greatness? And Jesus is realizing we are lost. We are separated from God. We are going to be cast into outer darkness if we do not find a way to be restored into what gives life, into the source of life, into the center of life. That's why he says to us, when he talks about following him, later he would again say, follow me. And then he'd clarify what. Because whoever tries to keep his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life will preserve it. Meaning whoever gives up this independent, separate self is going to find true life if they give it for me, if they recenter themselves in me. Only in that center do we truly find life. Only in that center. You and I are otherwise going to be spinning. As Tim Keller says, it's like being the astronaut who's on the ship up in the outer atmosphere where there's no gravity. And when the astronaut goes and he tries to screw something in, right? He takes a screwdriver and he goes to screw. What happens? He's as likely to spin as the screw itself. Because without gravity, you're just spinning. Without something that centers you and serves as that center, that locks you in, you're going to spin around everything else. And I think in so many ways, our lives, we're going to try to plug into somebody, plug into a job, plug into an identity, and we're going to spin. And we're going to try so hard and realize that we're just spinning like it's spinning. There is no gravity. And Jesus is coming and saying, and declaring, He is coming from the center and source of everything. He is the center, and in Him we can reconnect. And there we find that God, who is the center, the gravity, we can find ourselves in. And that our significance is not in trying to find all these things. Our significance is in Him. That is our whole dilemma. We say, well, I'll find myself separate from anything. I don't believe you'll ever find who you really are. I think that's what we're told about our whole condition is in the garden. Adam and Eve said, we can find ourselves without God. Let's try that. And they found that trying to be more than human, they became less than human. And Jesus is declaring that actually when you realize you're a part of God and you give yourself to that and He restores you to that, you find yourself, your goodness, that you are substantive, that you are significant, all by the very nature of who you are in relationship to Him. And that's what He's seeking to restore. So He comes to them as that center. And when we come into that, we realize not only our significance, but we realize that we are rooted in love. We are rooted in being wanted, if you will. In John 17, He says, I made you known to them, He's speaking to the Father, and will continue to make you known in order that what? That the love you have, speaking to His Father in heaven, for me may be in them, and that I myself may be in them. So once He's saying we are restored to the center, the source of everything, and into that eternal love that is unending. We read, Paul would bring this out in the book of Romans, and he says, for the Spirit that God has given you does not make you slaves and cause you to be afraid. Instead, the Spirit makes you God's children. As we receive Jesus and then we receive His Spirit, that which makes us God's children. And by the Spirit's power, we cry out to God, Father, my Father, as we sang this morning. God's Spirit, it says, joins Himself to our spirits to declare that we are God's children. That we are once again now connected to life. that we are living in relationship to the gaze of a Father, that in the same way, I think if we could get in touch with this, there is nothing like the power of a human father and all their limitations to be able to look into the eyes of their child and say, you are significant. Not because of what you did. You are significant. Done and over, you are. And you are loved. You are wanted. The power of a father to say that into a child is only a mere reflection of the fact that that's what every human soul was meant to know and experience in God. And that is what Jesus is in calling life to, and calling as He brings that to bear. We could say this, that the truth is you are not just matter, you matter to God. And the difference is huge. The difference is what defines whether you have life or not. You don't just exist, you were meant to exist. Your existence is not pointless, but personal and purposeful. Your soul, yourself, has substance. Let me say that again. I believe that you, yourself, your soul has substance. It is not merely material and coming and going. It didn't just kind of randomly appear. You are not hollow. You have a real existence in God. Or as Mother Teresa added, all that we have, and indeed our very existence, is one of the unique and never to be equated ways God has chosen to express Himself in time and space. You and God have substance. That's what it means that God believes in you. He believes that you are real. He believes that you were meant to be here. Your being yourself has substance. And that is why Jesus is calling them to give themselves to Him and return to that. Remember, as Jesus said, the whole story of your life could be summed up in the story of the prodigal son. You left home, said you didn't want God, and found out in the end you had nothing. You're exploited by this world. Until you what? The story says, till he comes to his senses and says, I need to go home. And there, only in the home of the Father, where the Father is honored again, and the Son realizes, I don't need to rebel against this Father. This Father is the source of my life. And he receives all the blessing. That is what our journey is, to come home to that reality. That's what Jesus wants to bring. Now, when these disciples, like you and I, hear that God has come after us, the natural thing for us to say is, wow, if only he knew who I really was. I'm quite sure he's made a mistake. And should I let him know about my real self? Because he'd never call me. I'm sure every one of those disciples are thinking, wow, do I deserve to be called by Jesus? If he's the Messiah, me? It's just overwhelming. And I think many of us do that. I think many of us live with the sense of, I want to be in with God, but I really don't know that there's just no way I'm okay. The only way I maybe get in is on the group deal. You know the group deal. Like we're all in this room. That's why in a big setting like this, it's okay. If I had asked you this morning, hey, would you like to come and meet one-on-one? Jesus will be here, His presence, and He'd like to just meet with you. Would it have felt different? Why? Because you're here to meet with His presence, right? What would have been different is you would have felt very vulnerable. You would have felt like He's going to look at me. See, we have this idea that we get in on the group deal. Like, I may not be that good, but supposedly there's like a group plan, and so like maybe I just kind of get swept in and included in that. But personally coming after me like He really knew me, I would never get that. Let me make this very clear. He comes as the one who knows you. And I'm not just saying that to kind of add some weight. Look at the story. It's very clear. Who did Jesus call? A group? No. He called them individually by name. In fact, I love how it unfolds. It says two of them were kind of following along behind Him, like, wow, John just said He's the Lamb of God. And then it says Jesus turns around and goes, what do you want? It's like you could almost feel like they were going, what, us? Like, we were just trying to hide it. That's the way a lot of us are. We're just like, I hope He doesn't look at us and figure out that we're kind of trying to follow. And He turns and He's like, What do you want? He's calling them out. He's calling you out as the one who knows you. And Lucas, one goes and gets his brother, Peter, Well, it wasn't Peter at the time. It's Simon. And what does Jesus do? Simon, let me tell you who you really are, or ultimately will be. You're going to be Peter, which is a play on the word and means the rock. So he's like, you're going to be a rock. And Peter's like, what? How does this guy give me this new kind of name or identity? He doesn't. I'm the most impetuous person I know. I'm no rock, and everybody knows it. But over time, Jesus kept pulling on that quality and ended up building his church on Peter's confession as a rock. So it's just amazing that he knew him. But I love it when Andrew goes and gets Nathaniel, and Nathaniel just made a joke about, Nazareth, nothing good comes from there. Come see. He shows up, and Jesus says, I saw you. And you could see Nathaniel going, did you see that part where I made the joke about the Nazareth thing? You didn't see that. I mean, I was just kidding, I just love it, He's just kind of dissed Jesus and then his hometown. And then Jesus says, I saw you sitting under the tree, Oh. How do you know me? How do you see me in that way? And the reality is, I think what they came to have to wrestle with, and so do you, is does he kind of know you, but he's ignorant of some? Or perhaps he knows you better than you know yourself. I know when I first was hearing of, that God was real and started to take hold of that reality and then began to actually realize that Jesus is the one who represents God and comes to save me, I started to think, you know what? I think he knows me in some way. And that was profound, but you know what? Wasn't too long before I realized, no, he actually knows me better than I know myself. I start to realize the longer I live, the more I'm not even sure what it means to know myself. It's just one big conflicted, confused sense. If I asked you, who are you? You'd be going, I don't know, It's like all these things run through me. I'm not sure I even get myself. Anybody else? You're not even sure you grasp who you are. And that's when you begin to realize he actually knows you better than you know yourself. And I think that's what you can feel that tension where it's like, I'm coming to call you out to be who you were in ways you don't yet see clearly yet. And we may never see clearly. In fact, we're told we will not even know who we are till we see him face to face. We're not even there, but there's this sense in which he knows you and he's calling you in that way. And finally, we see here that Christ calls us as the master of life and living. He is the one who doesn't come merely to call us out and merely to kind of save us and connect us to life, but to lead us in life because he is the one who is that master, who understands it. And a lot of times we think of Jesus as he's my Savior, and quite relevant that I have a relationship to Jesus for that eternal life thing that's going to come. That is not the way they ever understood it. It's not the way we were meant to ever understood it. To know him is to know how to live now. What he brings to bear is a connection to eternity. Last I checked, eternity is not forward. It's backwards and forward. It's eternity. It's already existing. And he's there to connect us as he was connected into eternity, to know how we live in this world that is yet to be fully redeemed. So they followed him as one followed a rabbi to give their whole selves to. That's why when they would say, I want to take your yoke, Jesus said, all of you who are weary, come to me and I will give you my yoke. It will fit you well. I know how to live more rightfully. I know how to live in such a way as you will find it easy, well-fitting. It will be good for your soul. He wants us to learn how to live through him rightfully in this world, not just in the future, but connected to eternity now and forever. And that's what he is calling us to. And so it is that when they would look for the rabbi, they would look for the one who had the way and who had the truth. But what did Jesus say? Jesus said, I am the way, I am the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So Jesus is, in a sense, saying, I am the one in whom you learn life and find everything in. And I am the one whom you discover who you really are. And his call to you today is to realize that he believes in you. And to stop making him like the object for whom you say, well, like, what's up with God? Well, here's my take on God. It's all about my take. It's all about what I believe. It's not. God will not be any different no matter what you believe. I would encourage you to trust and ask a different question. Does he believe in you? Because if he doesn't, there is no hope. And he does. And that's why Jesus came. And he beckons us and he's calling us. And he's calling us to discover more deeply and profoundly who we really are. I'm going to close with a story I think I shared once before. It's the story of the young tiger who loses his parents, and he's ended up raised among goats. And this herd of goats. And so all he can do is learn a goat's way of life. So even though he's different by nature entirely than goats, he kind of learns to start munching grass, in the meadow. That's not his nature, but I guess that's how he's going to survive. And then he learns to kind of butt heads as goats do. And he kind of tries to do his best little butt heading thing as he's raised. And as he gets older, he learns to even make kind of a bleating sound like sheep makes. Bah. But it's not very good because he's not really a goat. But he does his best to do that. And at times there's something in his little nature and his emerging nature that says there's more. That he's not really a goat, that there's something greater in him. But what do you do when you have those senses? You just think maybe that's just part of the way we dream about things. It's just part of that dream life thing. Or maybe it's just the fact that somehow we all want to have an aspiration. So he puts those things aside and he just continues to live as a goat. Until the day in which a true tiger comes to the edge of the meadow. And he emerges there, all tiger, and lets out this enormous roar of a tiger. And all of the sheep suddenly freeze, and all of the sheep begins to take off in terror. But what's he going to do? And here he is, he's tiger, and something in the roar of that tiger resonates in him. Something in him reverberates in him. Wait, that's the sound that is inside of me. That's a declaration of what I'm meant to be. But there's another part that goes, oh, but I'm terrified because I don't know how to be that. I know how to be a goat, and all the goats are taking off. And he has to decide. And I think that's what we have to decide. What are you going to do? Because Jesus is on the edge of your existence, beckoning you. He is on the edge of your life, and he's roaring, he's calling us. And the question for us is, do we dare to give ourselves to the one who believes in us and calls us and roars? Let's pray. God, we come with all of us in this room with the obvious questions about our existence. We come as those who have to realize that we're not sure what we're rooted in. We're not sure if we really matter or if we are just matter. We're not sure if we're hollow or there is substance to our beings. And Jesus, today, some of us want to recognize and respond and acknowledge that you are the one who has come to reveal that we are believed in, that we are called out. That our lives are no longer going to find themselves by trying to find ourselves within ourselves. And God, we offer you our own kind of foolish sense of freedom, our foolish independence. We realize that you are the root of all life. You are the center. You are our gravity. And that, Jesus, you've come to restore us, to help us come home and find ourselves. And we ask now that, Jesus, you would receive us, that we would want to say, we will follow you. We will follow you and receive your work on the cross for us, your sacrifice for us. Follow you in life as daughters and sons of God our Father. that we would receive now the dignity of the household, which says that we are not merely matter. We're children. We're not merely here to be used by others, but to live as those who were created above the angels. And above all, we just receive that